Imagine a world where the Bible was never written, where the concept of democracy never crossed a human mind, and where the Parthenon in Athens was never built. This is not a world of savagery, but of suffocating order. A world where the year 1177 BC was not the end, but the beginning of an eternal stagnation. A desperate, starving mass of humanity fleeing famine in the north, bringing their wives, children, and ox carts with them. Listen closely, and you can hear the terrifying sound that heralded their arrival. Not just the clash of swords, but the screeching of thousands of ungreased wooden axles, the lowing of emaciated cattle, and the guttural cries of warriors clad in horned helmets. They were a swarm of locusts in human form. Ugarit burned. Hattusa starved. Mycenae crumbled into ruin, its great lion gate buried under ash. But in this alternate timeline, let us change one variable: communication. Let us imagine that the great king of the Hittites, Suppiluliuma II, and the pharaoh of Egypt, Ramesses III, do not underestimate the threat. In our timeline, diplomatic letters moved at the speed of a donkey cart, often arriving months too late to coordinate a defense. But here, the intelligence network is faster, perhaps driven by a desperate fear of the rumors coming from the west. The political climate of 1178 BC is tense. There are backroom deals happening in the shadowed halls of the royal palaces. In Egypt, where Ramesses is not just watching the borders, he's watching his own back. The harem conspiracy is brewing, a plot by a minor queen to slit his throat and place her son on the throne. The court is a nest of vipers. Propaganda is plastered on every temple wall, depicting the pharaoh as an invincible god, crushing his enemies. But the people know the truth. The Nile floods have been low for 3 years. The gods are angry. Meanwhile, in the Hittite capital, the situation is even more dire. The grain silos are empty. Suppiluliuma has sent desperate pleas to Egypt for wheat just to keep his army from mutinying. It is a matter of life and death, the clay tablets read. But in this new timeline, Ramesses listens. He realizes that if the Hittites fall, Egypt stands alone. The price of emmer wheat has skyrocketed. Panic buying has emptied the market stalls of Ashkelon and Gaza. But amidst this chaos, a single courier arrives at the Egyptian fortress in Canaan. He bears a clay tablet wrapped in leather, sealed with the distinct cylinder seal of the Hittite king. It contains intelligence on the sea people's movements, their numbers, and crucially, their landing point. This is the turning point. The moment the Bronze Age decides it will not go gently into that good night. Here is the expanded script, formatted strictly for text-to-speech with a focus on sensory immersion, socio-economic depth, and political intrigue. Scene start. Narrator. 3 times its usual value. Let us be precise about what this means for the common man living in the shadow of the Nile. A single sack of emmer wheat, which once cost 2 copper deben, now trades for 10. In the markets of Ramesses, gold has lost its luster. You cannot eat gold. Desperation has a distinct smell. It smells of unwashed bodies crowded into the temples, begging the gods for a flood that never comes. It smells of smoke rising from the granaries, torched by mobs who realize the state reserves are empty. We are seeing the first recorded strikes in history turning into open insurrection. The social contract between the pharaoh and his people is dissolving. To the north, the situation in the Hittite lands is even bleaker. The grain shipments from Egypt have stopped. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma II knows his empire is fracturing from within. The vassals are restless. The factions at court are sharpening their knives. In the dark, cool corridors of the palace at Hattusa, whispers of a coup are growing louder than the prayers to the storm god. Here is the expanded script, tailored for a top-tier documentary channel with strict adherence to TTS formatting and narrative depth. The year is 1177 BC. To historians in our timeline, this specific year marks the crescendo of the late Bronze Age collapse. It is the moment when the complex, interconnected civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the king realizes that a foreign war is the only thing that can unite his crumbling state. He needs an enemy. He needs a distraction. So, instead of facing the sea peoples separately, the great powers do the unthinkable. They form a grand coalition. This is unprecedented. The Egyptians and Hittites, mortal enemies who fought to a stalemate at Kadesh a century prior, now embrace. But this is not a friendship born of love. It is a marriage of terror. Diplomatic couriers, riding horses to near death, carry clay tablets wrapped in silk between the capitals. They draft secret protocols. The old Treaty of Kadesh, once a mere piece of silver, becomes a lifeline. The logistics of this alliance are staggering. We are talking about the movement of thousands of tons of grain to feed the gathering armies. But where does the grain come from in a famine? It comes from the mouths of the poor. The state seizes the harvest by force. We are talking about the state seizing the private merchant fleets of Ugarit and Byblos to transport troops. The wealthy merchants of the Levant, men who grew fat on the trade of tin and lapis lazuli, watch in horror as their ships are commandeered. Their crews are pressed into service. The economy is shifted entirely to a war footing. The peasants are taxed not just in grain, but in blood, conscripted by the thousands to hold spears they barely know how to use. Imagine the sound of this mobilization, the grinding of whetstones sharpening bronze, the bleating of livestock being driven to slaughter to feed the encampments. It is the sound of an entire civilization tensing its muscles for one final punch. As the sea peoples descend upon the Syrian coast, expecting the fragmented, starving resistance they found elsewhere, they do not find helpless merchant cities. They sail their ships, with prows carved like the heads of birds, into the harbor of Ugarit. They are bringing their families, their ox carts. They are not just invaders. They are migrants fleeing their own apocalypse. They expect plunder. Instead, they find the combined chariot armies of the known world waiting for them. The Battle of Ugarit becomes the defining moment of the ancient world. Picture the scene. The sun beating down on the white stone walls of the city. The heat is oppressive, a physical weight on the shoulders of the men in armor. The smell of salt spray mixing with the dust of 10,000 horses. The sea peoples, a motley collection of Shardana, Peleset, and Shekelesh, swarm the beaches. They are fierce, armed with long slashing swords and round shields. They fight with a chaotic, desperate energy. But they are disorganized. They are fighting for survival. but their enemies are fighting for order. Suddenly, the trap is sprung. From the hills, hidden behind the olive groves, the heavy Hittite chariots emerge. These are not the light skirmishing vehicles of the past. These are three-man vehicles, built like tanks, with a driver, a shield bearer, and a spearman. They thunder down the slope. The ground shakes. The sound is deafening, a rhythmic, terrifying rumble that vibrates in the chest of every warrior. It sounds like the earth itself is cracking open. Simultaneously, the Egyptian fleet, maneuvered into the harbor behind the sea people's ships, unleashes a cloud of arrows that blots out the sun. The sky turns dark with bronze-tipped death. The massacre is total. The heavy chariots plow through the infantry lines, turning men into pulp. The Egyptian archers pick off the survivors in the surf. The sea peoples are not just defeated, they are annihilated. The surf turns red for miles. The cries of the dying are drowned out by the roar of the victor. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Canaanites, and the New Kingdom Egyptians suddenly and violently fell apart. In our history, a perfect storm of earthquakes, drought, internal rebellion, and the mysterious marauders known as the Sea Peoples wiped the slate clean. This collapse threw humanity into a 300-year dark age. But from that darkness, new ideas emerged: iron, the alphabet. The surviving prisoners are branded with the cartouches of the pharaoh, enslaved, and put to work repairing the very walls they sought to destroy. The crisis of 1177 BC is averted. The systems do not collapse. The bureaucracy holds. The scribes continue to tally the tax receipts. The trade routes remain open, allowing the flow of tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus to resume. But this victory brings the immediate consequences, spanning the first 5 to 10 years after the battle. In our world, the collapse broke the power of the palace elites. It leveled the playing field. But here, the elites have won, and they will make sure no one ever challenges them again. The end. Here is the expanded script, rewritten for a viral documentary format with the strict TTS adherence. Scenes start. Visuals, slow-motion panning shots of a massive fortified Bronze Age city. Smoke rises from a sacrificial altar. The sound of heavy drums and a low, droning horn. It leveled the playing field. But here, in this timeline, the victory reinforces them. The great kings claim their survival is proof of their divinity. In Hattusa and Thebes, the central bureaucracies do not fracture. Instead, they tighten their grip until it strangles the life out of the streets. The logic is simple, terrifyingly simple. We survived because we were strong. We survived because we followed orders. Therefore, dissent is treason. The political climate shifts violently toward totalitarianism. The pharaohs and great kings use the victory not just as a celebration, but as a sharp, bloody propaganda tool to purge their courts of rivals. Consider the atmosphere in the court of Ramesses III. In our timeline, he faced the harem conspiracy, a throat-slitting plot born of desperation and decline. But here, a victorious pharaoh is untouchable. He turns to his viziers, the men who control the Nile tax boats, and he asks a simple question. Who doubted us? You questioned the allocation of grain during the war. Treason. You suggested negotiating with the tribes of the Delta. Sedition execution. hundreds of mid-level officials, the men who actually knew how to run the irrigation networks, are dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Their bodies are thrown into the Nile, food for the crocodiles, a grim warning to anyone who would dare whisper against the state. The bureaucracy becomes less efficient, but infinitely more loyal. It becomes a machine of silence. Visuals: a split screen. On the left, a golden palace banquet. On the right, a muddy, desperate farmer counting seeds. The socio-economic impact is crushing for the common man. We must understand the sheer cost of this survival. The war against the sea peoples was ruinously expensive. To pay for the tens of thousands of Sheridan mercenaries and to replace the hundreds of lost ships, the state treasuries are empty. To refill them, taxes remain at emergency levels for decades. In the marketplace of Ugarit and Pyrames, inflation runs rampant. The price of a single sack of emmer wheat triples. A jar of olive oil, once a staple of the Mediterranean diet, becomes a luxury item only the priesthood can afford. The peasant farmer, who in our timeline might have fled to the hills to start a new life in an independent village, perhaps becoming one of the first free Israelites or Greek settlers, finds no escape here. The borders are patrolled. The census takers are everywhere. He is chained to his land by debt and decree. The palaces act as hoarders. Paranoid of another invasion, they stockpile grain, bronze, and gold in massive windowless silos. They suck the surplus out of the economy, the city-state, the individual. But what if things went differently? What if the storm passed? What if the great kings of the Bronze Age survived the cataclysm? To understand this alternate timeline, we must first immerse ourselves in the sensory reality of the late Bronze Age. It is a world of suffocating grandeur and fragile complexity. It is not merely a map of empires. The gap between the elite and the peasantry widens into a chasm that no ladder can climb. The rich wear linen so fine it is almost transparent, imported from the weaver workshops of the Nile, smelling of myrrh and frankincense. Meanwhile, the poor wrap themselves in rough, scratching wool and eat gruel mixed with grit that grinds their teeth down to the gums by the age of 30. With the military intact and emboldened by victory, rebellion is impossible. The chaotic freedom that allows for innovation, the messiness that births new ideas, is crushed under the iron-rimmed wheels of a chariot. Visuals: close up on a clay tablet. A hand presses a stylus into the wet clay. It looks mechanical, rigid. No. The Mycenaean Greeks, those warrior traders who in our timeline would lose their language and palaces in a ball of fire, remain firmly in power. The One Axe. The Mycenaean High King continues to rule from his citadel. There is no migration of Dorian Greeks. There is no loss of the linear B script. But we must look closer at what this means. Linear B is not a script for poets. It is a script for accountants. It is a clumsy, syllabic system with hundreds of characters. It is used to count sheep, jars of scented oil, and chariot wheels. It is complex, difficult to learn, and restricted to a tiny, elite guild of scribes who work directly for the palace. In our timeline, the collapse destroyed this guild. The Greeks forgot how to write, and when they learned again centuries later, they adopted the Phoenician alphabet. a simple phonetic system of 20-some letters that anyone could learn, a script that allowed for Homer, for philosophy, for democracy. But here, that never happens. The scribes have no incentive to share their knowledge. To keep their power, they keep literacy a secret. There is no Iliad. There is no Odyssey. Only lists of tax receipts and inventories of bronze ingots stretching on for centuries. Visuals, a map of the ancient Near East. It looks static. Heavy borders in red, blue, and yellow. Moving into the midterm effects, 50 to 100 years later, we see a terrifying geopolitical stagnation. In our timeline, the vacuum left by the fall of the Hittites allowed the rise of smaller, agile states like Israel, Phoenicia, and the Aramean kingdoms. It allowed the Assyrians to eventually surge forward. It created a marketplace of ideas where monotheism and the alphabet could take root. But in this timeline, the vacuum never opens. The Hittite Empire does not fall. It remains the Colossus of Anatolia, a heavy militaristic state that checks the ambitions of Assyria to the east and Egypt to the south. These three superpowers lock shields. They form a cartel of control. They regulate the trade routes strictly. If you want to move tin from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean, you pay the Great King's tariff. If you want to ship copper from Cyprus, you use the Pharaoh's ships. The map of the Middle East freezes. These three superpowers. Here is the expanded script, optimized for text-to-speech with dramatic pacing, sensory, immersion, and deep socio-economic context. Hatti, Egypt, and Assyria lock themselves into a perpetual Cold War. A three-way standoff that freezes the political map of the Near East. They fight proxy battles over the city-states of Canaan, turning the Levant into a meat grinder of endless skirmishes. But this is not a war of annihilation. It is a war of economics. Consider the cost of a single campaign. To march an army of 10,000 men from Thebes to the Euphrates requires tons of grain. It is a living, breathing machine. Imagine the smell of cedar wood burning in the temples of Hattusa, the cloying scent of myrrh masking the stench of the sweating, unwashed masses in Thebes, and the metallic tang of bronze polishing in the armories of Mycenae. It is a world of globalization 1.0. Thousands of gallons of beer, and chests full of silver debens to pay mercenaries. The great kings realized that direct conflict is too expensive. It is bad for business, so they squeeze the buffer zones. Imagine the sensory experience of a city like Jerusalem in this timeline. It is not the holy capital of an independent kingdom of Judah. It is a vassal city. A suffocating checkpoint. Walk through the gates. The air does not smell of incense or sacrifice. It smells of foreign sweat and bureaucratic decay. The streets are choked with the foreign uniforms of Egyptian garrisons, or perhaps Hittite diplomats, depending on who bribed the local governor last week. The architecture remains heavy, fortified, and oppressive. Massive cyclopean walls block out the sun. This is not a city designed for the people. It is a storage facility for grain meant to feed foreign armies. The locals, they are invisible. They keep their heads down. They pay tribute to foreign masters in olive oil and wine, leaving barely enough for their own children. They listen to the heavy clatter of bronze-shod hooves on the cobblestones. The sound of their occupation. Let us talk about technology. This is perhaps the most profound change. In our world, the shortage of tin caused by the disruption of trade routes, forced blacksmiths to figure out how to work with iron. Iron is democratizing. It is cheap. It is found in every swamp and hillside. Once you know how to smelt it, you can arm a peasant army. You can make plowshares that turn the heavy soil of the valleys, expanding the food supply and exploding the population. But in this alternate world, the trade routes never collapsed. The tin road from Afghanistan remains open. Ships laden with copper from Cyprus continue to dock at the busy wharves of Ugarit. The economy is booming, but only for the 1%. Why would a king switch to iron? To the elite? Iron is ugly. It rusts. It smells of blood. It is difficult to work. Bronze is golden. It is beautiful. It polishes to a mirror sheen that reflects the glory of the sun god. But more importantly, the kings control the copper mines and the tin caravans. They own the supply chain. To outfit a single chariot team with bronze armor and weapons costs the equivalent of 20 years of a peasant's wages. This price barrier is intentional. By maintaining the Bronze Age, they maintain a monopoly on violence. There is no Iron Age revolution. Warfare remains the sport of the elite charioteers, noblemen who treat battle like a glorified hunting trip. The common man never gets a sword. He never gets the tool that might allow him to overthrow his master. If a blacksmith is caught experimenting with iron, he is not celebrated as an innovator. He is executed for treason. Culturally, the impact is devastating to what we consider Western civilization. Consider the alphabet. In reality, the Phoenicians spread their phonetic alphabet because the complex systems of cuneiform and hieroglyphs were tied to the destroyed palaces. When the palaces burned, the writing systems died with them. Merchants needed something simple to record transactions on the fly. But here, the palaces survive and the scribal guilds survive. We must understand the politics of literacy. In this world, reading and writing are not rights. They are guarded secrets. The scribes are a powerful union, a deep state within the palace walls. They spend 12 years memorizing thousands of complex symbols. This complexity is their job security. They charge exorbitant fees to draft treaties, land deeds, and royal decrees. They view a simple as 30-letter alphabet as an existential threat. A merchant could send a shipment of tin from the mountains of Afghanistan to a workshop in Cyprus to be alloyed with copper and finally sold as a finished sword in the markets of Sardinia. But this system is rigid. It is top-heavy. It relies on the flow of goods remaining uninterrupted. The entire economy is a palace economy. The king owns the land. The king owns the grain. If a farmer can read the law, he can question the law. If a merchant can write his own contracts, he does not need the scribe. So they lobby the kings. They whisper in the ears of pharaohs and emperors. They brand the alphabet as a tool of smugglers, bandits, and anarchists. Propaganda spreads through the market squares. True words are written in the sacred signs. They say, the simplified script is an insult to the gods. The alphabet remains a niche curiosity, used perhaps by criminals in the back alleys of Byblos, but never adopted by nations. Linear B remains the script of Greece, freezing their culture in a bureaucratic catalogue of inventory lists, which brings us to the long-term effects spanning 200 to 500 years. The year is now roughly 700 BC. In our timeline, this is the era of the archaic age in Greece, the rise of the police, the experiment of democracy, the writing of the Iliad. But in this world, the Aegean is silent. There are no city-states, no Athens, no Sparta, just the aging, monolithic fortresses of Mycenaean warlords paying tribute to the superpowers in the east, locked in a golden cage of stagnation. Expanded script was Part 5, The Stirring of Roman Origins. It is a time of dynamic, chaotic growth. But in this timeline, silence. There is no Homer. There is no blind bard weaving tales by a fire, singing of the grey-eyed Athena or the wine-dark sea. In our world, the Iliad and the Odyssey were born from the ashes of collapse, a cultural memory of a golden age lost to fire. They were stories that humanized the enemy and questioned the morality of slaughter. But here, the Mycenaean citadels never burned. The walls of Mycenae and Tiryns still stand tall, imposing, suffocating. The oral traditions of the Trojan War are sanitized by the Mycenaean kings, instead of a tragic epic about the rage of Achilles and the folly of kings. The stories are state-sanctioned propaganda. They portray the one-axe, the High King, as a flawless victor, ruling by divine right. Imagine the art of this period. It is not the emotional, fluid sculpture of classical Greece. It is rigid, monumental. It serves one purpose: intimidation, the ambiguity, the humanity, the critique of power. It is all scrubbed away by the scribes. These scribes do not write poetry, they write lists. Linear B-script remains the only form of writing, a dry bureaucratic tool used exclusively for inventory. 500 jars of olive oil, 300 sheep, 20 bronze ingots. There is no literature, only accounting. And because of this, there is no democracy in Athens. Why would there be? The concept of the citizen does not exist. You are a subject. You are a cog in the redistributive palace economy. Walk through Athens in this timeline. It is not a city of white marble and open debate. It is a fortress of rough-hewn stone sitting atop the Acropolis, looking down on a population of serfs. You belong to the palace. The agora, the marketplace where ideas were exchanged in our Athens, is just a place to pay taxes in this timeline. It smells of unwashed bodies and fear. There are no philosophers debating the nature of virtue. There is only the sound of heavy bronze scales weighing grain and the sharp crack of the overseer's staff. Greece remains a peripheral collection of warlords loyal to the great powers, squabbling over scraps from the pharaoh's table. And without the power vacuum in the Levant, the 12 tribes of Israel are likely absorbed or dispersed. The kingdom of David and Solomon never forms. This changes everything. Think about the religious implications. Monotheism. The belief in one God struggles to take root, and the king distributes the rations. If the king fails, the world starves. In the streets of Ugarit, the grand trade hub of the Syrian coast, the tension is palpable. The sensory overload of the bazaar has changed. Where once there was the rich aroma of roasting lamb and spices from the east, now there is only the dry, dusty taste of grit in the air. In our history, Yahweh became the sole God of Israel. partly because the other gods, the gods of the great empires, had failed. The empires had collapsed. Marduk could not save Babylon from the fire. Amun could not save Thebes from the famine. When the world fell apart, the people needed a god who transcended the state. But here, Amun is doing just fine. The temples of Karnak are overflowing with gold from Nubia and cedar from Lebanon. The storm god of the Hittites is still delivering victories on the battlefield. The god kings of Egypt and Hatti are undeniably powerful and successful. Their legitimacy is unquestioned. Why would you worship a desert god of morality when the golden gods of the empire can guarantee you bread and safety? Yahweh remains a local deity of a minor hill tribe, or perhaps is synchronized into the Egyptian pantheon as a minor war god, a footnote in a papyrus scroll. The religious landscape of the world remains polytheistic, focused on the maintenance of state power rather than personal salvation. There are no prophets speaking truth to power, because power is absolute. But what about the wider world? The economic ripples are catastrophic for the common man. The delay of the Iron Age slows down deforestation and agriculture. Bronze is an aristocrat's metal. It requires copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan, a trade route controlled entirely by the elite. As long as the great powers hold the monopoly on bronze, they hold the monopoly on violence. They have no incentive to develop iron, a metal that is cheap, plentiful, and available to the peasant. Without iron tools to clear the deep forests of Europe and Africa, populations grow slower. The colonization of the Western Mediterranean by Greeks and Phoenicians is state-run, not driven by refugees or independent pioneers seeking a new life. Carthage might be founded, but not as the vibrant queen of the Mediterranean. It is an Egyptian outpost, strictly controlled by a governor appointed from Thebes. It is not a republic of merchants. It is a naval base for the extraction of silver from Spain. The harbor does not bustle with independent traders. It is patrolled by royal war barges, enforcing the pharaoh's price controls. And Rome, poor Rome, in our history, Rome rose from the ashes of the Etruscan civilization, fueled by a scrappy, adaptive culture that thrived on adversity. But in this timeline, the Etruscans are not a fading power. They are powerful trading partners of the Hittites and Mycenaeans. The Etruscan city-states are fat and wealthy, acting as the middleman for the tent trade into Central Europe. They have no reason to fall. So, on the banks of the Tiber River, the seven hills do not give rise to a senate or a legion. Rome remains a cluster of muddy huts, inhabited by pig farmers and shepherds living in the shadow of their Etruscan masters. There is no republic, there is no empire, just a swamp, where history is stagnant. Here is the expanded script, formatted strictly for text-to-speech with emphasized sensory details and socioeconomic context. They are firmly integrated into the Bronze Age system, but integration in this world means subjugation. The village on the Tiber, a collection of muddy hills and thatch roofs that we know as Rome, is likely crushed long before it can ever rise. It is not destroyed by a rival ideology, but by the sheer weight of Bronze Age economics. Etruscan kings, mere vassals of the sprawling Hittite hegemony, descend from the north. They do not bring the disciplined legions of the future, but the terrifying rumble of heavy chariots. The air fills with the copper tang of blood and the heavy, sulphurous smell of burning timber. The Romans' Republic, with its Senate, its radical ideas of law, its concept of res publica, the public thing, the chatter of commerce has been replaced by the hushed whispers of anxiety. Inflation is rampant. In the past decade, the cost of a single sack of barley has risen from 1 deben of copper to 4. A skilled artisan, perhaps a tomb builder, in the Valley of the Kings, finds his monthly wage of 5 sacks of grain delayed again and again. This leads to the first recorded labor strikes in history, strangled in the crib. There is no forum. There are no speeches. The Latin language remains a peasant dialect, grunted in the fields and whispered in slave quarters, never written down, eventually forgotten. The very concept of citizen never enters the human vocabulary. As we look 1,000 years later, to the time of what should be Christ, the world is unrecognizable. It is a world of suffocating stability. 3 or 4 massive slow-moving empires dominate the globe. The geopolitical map has frozen. The borders between the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Assyrians have barely moved in a millennium. They have settled into a comfortable, corrupt equilibrium. Technological progress is incredibly slow, glacial, paralyzed by bureaucracy. To understand why, we must look at the economy. In this timeline, the trade routes for tin and copper are controlled by the state. The price of bronze remains artificially high, keeping weapons and tools out of the hands of the common man. Without the competition of small states, without the desperate, clawing need to innovate to survive, there is no pressure to change. Consider the steam engine. We might see steam toys in the courts of Alexandria, intricate brass spheres spinning to open temple doors, or entertain the pharaoh while he feasts on figs and imported wine. But we would never see a steam engine build a factory. Why? Because of the economics of flesh. Why build a temperamental, expensive machine when you have millions of slaves? When the Hittites or Egyptians conquer a neighbor, they flood the market with human labor. A slave costs less than a good ox, and far less than a machine. The abundance of misery kills the incentive for industry. We might have intricate clockwork, strictly for the amusement of the court, but no printing press. The scribes, that jealous guild of elite writers, would never allow it. Their power relies on the fact that literacy is difficult, expensive, and rare. A machine that allows a peasant to read, that spreads ideas faster than a chariot can ride. That is not progress to them. That is heresy. It is a threat to the stability of the state, and it would be crushed with a ruthless efficiency. And here lies the twist. We often view the collapse of civilization as the worst thing that can happen. We look at the ruins of the Bronze Age, the fallen walls of Mycenae, the burned archives of Ugarit, and we mourn the lost grandeur. We see the smoke rising from the palaces, and we think of the Dark Age as a time of misery. But this timeline reveals a hard, uncomfortable truth. The collapse, the Dark Age, was necessary. The chaos broke the monopoly of the god kings. It shattered the rigid, top-down command economies that benefited only the 1%. When the palaces burned, the trade routes for tin failed. This forced the common people to turn to a cheaper, uglier, more difficult metal: iron. Iron is everywhere. It is democratic. It gave the peasant a weapon that could kill a chariot driver. It gave the farmer a plow that could break rocky soil. The Dark Age was a crucible. It burned away the fat of the old empires. It allowed the little guy, the merchant trading olive oil in a leaky boat, the iron smith hammering away in a smoky hut, the poet singing of rage and war to matter. In a world where the Bronze Age never ended, there is peace. There is order. There is incredible wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. The palaces are filled with gold and lapis lazuli. The granaries are full of wheat harvested by state-owned serfs. The air in the capital city smells of expensive cedar wood and frankincense, masking the stench of the stagnation below. But there is no freedom. There is no us. The social fabric is tearing. The gap between the elite, feasting on imported wine and honey, and the hollow-cheeked peasantry is growing dangerously wide. In our history, the Sea Peoples were a terrifying, decentralized force that overwhelmed these fracturing civilizations one by one. They were not an army. They were a migration. There is no philosophy that questions the nature of the universe, because to question the universe is to question the king. There is only theology that confirms the king's divine right to rule. There is no science that seeks to understand the natural world, only engineering meant to build bigger monuments, higher obelisks, larger tombs to house the dead egos of living gods. The darkness of the collapse was the womb of the modern world. By saving the empires of the past, by preventing the fires of the 12th century BC, we would have forfeited the future. We would be living in a stagnant, golden cage, eternal slaves to an eternal pharaoh, watching the same sun rise over the same unchanged empire forever